Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for today's webinar, The New Deal in a Post-Pandemic World. Bless you.
Thank you.
As a part of the Consultants Collective Conversations 2021 Trends Series. I'm Adria Barich, an associate for Consultants Collective, as well as the editor for Biznology. Today's webinar is being presented by GEM and our consulting division, Consultants Collective. Following the webinar, a recording will be posted on biznology.com, and I'll be sending you all an email after the event with a brief survey and a link to the recording so that you can share it with your colleagues. I am joined by GEM CEO Jen McClure, as well as our featured speakers, Consultants Collective member consultants Gurmeet Ahluwalia and Mark Dollins.
I'm just looking at the pictures on the slide here, Adria. All four of us look so young and optimistic. These are definitely pre-pandemic photos.
Totally.
Yeah.
Mine is not, but it's heavily touched.
It's fantastic.
Thank you, Adrian. And welcome, everybody. I'm excited about this conversation today. I'm Jen McClure, as Adria said, CEO of GEM and Managing Director of Consultants Collective. And I am really pleased to be joined by two of our member consultants, Gurmeet Ahluwalia and Mark Dollins. Gurmeet is the Managing Director of StratX Lead, and he has over 20 years of experience in helping organizations in a variety of industries and around the world along their transformation journey. He is also a board member and advisor to the Minister of Innovation and Chief Statistician of Canada. There is a newly formed board that I cannot remember the name of, but
Statistics Canada, yeah.
Statistics Canada. And he's led major transformation programs at a variety of companies and is an organizational change expert. And Mark Dollins is president of North Star Communications Consulting. He focuses on employee and change communication strategy. He's provided communications consulting services to Visa, Toyota, Louis Vuitton, Xerox, Keep America Beautiful, and United Technologies, and a gazillion more. He was previously executive and global employee communications, head of executive and global employee communications for DuPont, leading communications for the company's 130 billion merger with Dow. And he was also chief communications officer at Pepsi Beverages. So these guys bring a lot of really great expertise, but also different perspectives. And you may or may not know that every year for Biznology, we ask our member consultants to identify the biggest predictions, trends, prognostications for the coming year. And we publish those on Biznology. And this year we felt that Gurmeet and Mark both were talking a lot about the changing relationships between employees and employers, the challenges of remote work and what happens when you return to work or don't return to work, and corporate culture and communications and compliance, and also the changing relationship between companies and cities where they are located with the move from, as we call it, the move from boom towns to Zoom towns. So we're going to talk about a wide variety of things. Adria, we could probably get rid of our beautiful photos and just be ourselves. So we titled this the New Deal in the Post-Pandemic World, and that term New Deal is experiencing a resurgence. I actually just heard it used this morning with regard to the COVID package that's being promoted in our Congress, Gurmeet, not in Canada. But what did you guys mean when you named this conversations topic about the New Deal between employers and employees?
Mark?
Well, I think it really just reflects the realities of, it's not post-COVID, obviously, but things are changing so quickly in terms of how companies are beginning to think or rethink what they're doing with real estate. They're thinking or rethinking what they're doing around culture and values. Employees have all kinds of new issues, whether it's childcare or elder care. I mean, all these things are combining to say, you know what, the old relationships between employers and employees have dramatically changed almost overnight. So as we thought about what's coming, it really became clear to us that employees and employers are going to have to constitute a new deal to figure out what does employment really look like and what changes are going to be required on both sides of the equation.
What are the challenges and opportunities around that, Gurmeet?
Well, you know, when we were first planning and discussing what we wanted to talk about here, we started with talking about the employees, and then we quickly switched it and talking from the employer standpoint, not just in terms of like the opportunities and what it's going to make, how it's going to make some things easier, but almost what are their responsibilities? What's the employer's responsibilities to their employees and to their communities, for example, with what's happened in the pandemic and so many people, other than sort of frontline workers, being able to work from home now. Companies aren't going to be able to say in the future that they can't accommodate people who need these for whatever reasons they are, whether it's health reasons that they can't leave their house, or for personal reasons. And so, what does this mean in terms of what companies have to do in terms of setting up for the future, and also with the possibility, just hopefully within the next few quarters, COVID will be under control. That doesn't mean another pandemic isn't going to hit in a couple of years. And so how do we prep for that in advance? But in the meantime, understanding that there's going to be a new normal, and people now see that organizations have the ability to allow their staff to work from home, to work from wherever they want to, and the impacts of that are still to be seen.
And I would just add, the more that we talked about the new responsibilities for employers and managers and employees in this world, the more all roads seem to lean back to a common theme around culture, and how that's really going to be driving a good portion of the change. And I don't know if you're aware, there's a fairly recent report from a UK-based firm called Gallagher, and they talked to 800 internal communications professionals all over the world. And they asked them, versus 2020, where are your efforts in 2021 going to be focused? And the number one answer came back from 43% of them was it's on culture and behaviors. And that actually outpaced issues like process and system changes that are going on in their organizations. So it really became very clear that as more people are not working in the traditional brick and mortar facilities, that organizations are indeed really starting to think about how does this play out in terms of what we value, in terms of our behaviors, how does it play out in terms of how we work with ethics and compliance, our mission, vision, and values. So these are all really critical things that are coming very quickly into focus. And so we started with, as Gurmeet mentioned, kind of conversations around these distinct, we'll call them internal stakeholders, starting with employers, and then kind of thinking about what does this mean for managers, right? And then what does this mean for employees? So kind of three different distinct audiences that all have unique challenges in front of them.
Yeah, and just to add to that, when we were talking to your last question, Jen, about calling it the New Deal, the other option for calling it was the avoiding the accidental culture, and being more deliberate about it. In that, if employees are you no longer have 20,000 employees in one location in 4 or 5 buildings in one city. And instead, people are spread out, and there's a lot more individual contributors working remotely. How do you be deliberate about making sure that you're leading them down the path that you want them to be led, in terms of the value of the organization, the communication style, the way that you want people to work together, and how does that change when there will be a mix? Right now, it's probably it's significantly remote. Before that, it was significantly together. Going forward, it's going to have to be a hybrid, and there's going to be some people who are 100% in the office. There's going to be some people who are 100% work from home, and there's going to be some people who are doing both. And understanding the challenges around that, from, as Mark said, the big picture thing is almost as big as an issue as some of the smaller details that all companies will have to deal with.
We all come from huge global organizations where it's not just 20,000 people in one location. It's 50, 100,000 people in 100 locations, right? Companies built by acquisition, people around the world in different business units, in different geographies, in different cultures already, right? So how much of this is a new problem, and how much of this is an opportunity to maybe address? I know that in my previous role, we discovered that there were probably hundreds of cultures, right? We were acquiring 30, 40 businesses a year. We had, offices in 110 countries. Some were huge, some were very small. We didn't have a huge work from home culture, but we certainly had a distributed culture or set of cultures. So I would say that there's some particularly for large global organizations, there's some continuation of the problem, and now it's extenuated into, we're even in littler
Groups,
pockets.
exactly. You don't want to move from the problem of having dozens or hundreds of different subcultures within your organization to having thousands of them. Like you said, I worked in an organization that was in over 100 countries as well, had maybe 250,000 employees at one time. Beyond those who are frontline, maybe there's 150,000 people working in offices. If they're all working at home for good, how do you make sure that there's at least some thread that ties throughout the organization? Again, not every organization is 250,000 people in 100 countries. Even those that are in 1, 2, 5, 10 countries, or 10, 15, 20 offices around in one area, they'll at least have some thread where the 1,000 people who are in one building, or the 5,000, 10,000 people who are in one city, have some opportunity to get together and work together. And the culture, just sometimes it's natural and sometimes it's pushed, but making sure that the organizations are deliberate about how they drive forward.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about existing employees, right? I mean, the pattern of going to work, moving through town halls or whatever regular communication venue they have access to, some of that will be residual, Jen, to your point. So, okay, it's not going to be new for those folks about what's happening with the culture, but the more those people spend time away from each other, working more independently, the more risk there is to just those existing employees beginning to kind of be a little bit less focused, or maybe another better word is lax, on how they honor, if you will, the values and the ethics and the right behavior, right, of an organization. When you then extend that to new employees, right, and there are many companies that have very high rates of attrition, and so they've got to do some rehiring. And when those people begin to join the organization in larger numbers, you can really quickly begin to see the potential risk of them not having the same orientation and not having the same experience or connectivity to each other and to the organization. So their ability to follow the values and the norms of those organizations is going to be very much challenged. I think when I think about organizations that do it well, right, that really focus on this, there are companies that make values a part of ongoing communication, and not just on large venues like town halls. And I have to think about my experience at DuPont. And one of the things that I admired about the company long before I got there was they're focused on core values. And they literally at every meeting, and it didn't matter if it was a global town hall or if it was a team meeting of 5 or 10 people, they started every meeting with what they called a core value contact. Right. So literally they said, all right, we're going to start with an environmental core value contact. Here's something that's happening in and around our team or our business. We're going to talk about respect for people, something that happened the other day I want to reinforce. But I mean, this was so entrenched in their culture that it's almost impossible to imagine that any kind of change would really facilitate something fundamentally different for that organization. So, but I want to get back to Gurmeet's point about it. You cannot have a culture in this environment by default. Organizations have got to double down and figure ways to make that kind of behavior that I was describing at DuPont part of the norm. And whether it's we have to structure our agendas for town halls to make sure that we review not only a core value contact like I was describing, but maybe we literally start talking about our compliance numbers, which was an issue at DuPont. And they routinely talked about whether they had increasing cases or reduced cases of violations or complaints around their ethics and compliance. So, I've often talked about this third wave of risk, right? So if organizations aren't doubling down and being proactive about what the behaviors that they want, what they'll accept and what they won't accept, they're going to get a culture by default, and it's probably not going to be what they want.
Yep.
Gurmeet, you identified when we were talking about the challenges of this new world, how do you identify employee burnout and the lack of engagement, and maybe even, nefarious behavior by employees that feel really disengaged? How do you, how do you tackle that in this new world?
Yeah, and it's a question and a problem that's been there for a long time. Ever since the possibility of work from home was there, And even if it's not necessarily nefarious, but the lost opportunity of working together. For example, I led a pilot program maybe almost 10 years ago, where I led a product team that worked very closely with our operations team and our technology team. And we thought, let's try working from home for our product team, and we'll still do the meetings and all that stuff. And what we found was there was a loss of what we called hallway conversations, right? Where a lot of work doesn't happen in formal meetings. It happens when you're passing somebody's office and you sit down and you just start chatting and you find out about something that's going on. And losing that is something that we have to be very careful of. So an example that came up last summer during sort of the height of the pandemic, at least here in Canada, I'm on the board of directors of a fintech based out of Montreal. Everybody moved remote virtually, like within days, and they felt some of that loss of community, loss of connection. And so what would happen is that even when people weren't in actual formal meetings, somebody would set up a Zoom room and it would be open. And so even if people were sitting there programming on their computer, they'd have another screen with, the other 25 people on their team on the Zoom, and they could listen, they could mute it out, whatever it was, but they felt like they were together and part of a team. And just like you're sitting in a bullpen. And so these sort of little unique things that individual employees came up with. I don't think this was a management effort. This was individual employees saying, "Hey guys, we used to always sit and talk while we're working. There's no reason why we can't do that while we're working from home." And so making sure that the employees have the freedom to drive and develop some of those things. These things, when they're driven top down, they can be a pain in the neck, right? If management says, "Hey, every Thursday we're going to have a virtual cocktail party," and then people saying, "It's 5 o'clock. I'm at home. I don't want to do this," or whatever the case is. But when employees are driving it, I think it is much more effective.
Yeah, I also think that there's a real opportunity in this for managers, right? Not executive leaders, but team leaders, team managers, who are going to have to develop greater skills with identifying that kinds of burnout that we're talking about, right? So managers on a good day before COVID were largely focused on getting the work out the door. And if they were good, they might do occasional coaching. They might be occasionally asking, what's going on? I can see something that's going on. Hey, your body language tells me X or Y. That's if they're really developed and evolved, right? As in those interpersonal kinds of communications. But now that many managers are working with more remote teams, they've got to develop different kinds of skill sets. And so organizations, so we talked about the onus being on employers, and this is something that employers really have to, also zoom in on, is how do we support our managers, our team leaders who are increasingly managing more remote teams, and telling them that they've got to find ways of building trust in their organization. They've got to find ways of building transparency in the way that they're, connecting and communicating and leading, setting even more clear expectations, because they don't have, the hallway conversations, the poke your head at the door in the office opportunities to say, hey, where's that thing, or how's that coming, or whatever. And also managing performance, both good and bad. But we know that many managers tend to shy away from taking on bad performance, right? Even when people are in their offices. So you can imagine how this is really accentuated with remote workers. So all of these things are clear signals that organizations have got to find ways of support, whether it's through training, different tools, check-ins with team leaders, special kinds of communication packages, et cetera, to help them better manage their teams and ultimately, manage their own performance through their team. So there's lots of things that are swirling around here, but clearly there's an opportunity for managers to step up.
Yeah, and I think if when we're talking about this, there's the issue of connectivity, making sure that there's the opportunities to have these types of discussions. And then there's connection, which is a little bit different. And when you think about, there's numerous studies that say when it comes to retaining employees and keeping employees happy, there's always, the benefits and salary and room for moving up. But some of the most important things are how connected they are to their colleagues and how they feel about their supervisor. And if they have very limited interaction, very limited connection, not just connectivity, very limited connection with those folks, it's going to be very difficult to retain the people that you want to retain because they're going to be looking for that connection. And we have to find a way to help our managers and help our leaders build that connection between them and their colleagues, and making sure and their staff, and making sure the staff have that opportunity to connect with each other.
You know, that actually leads into one of our questions, and I want to encourage people to use the Q&A function and give us your questions. We love to just have a wide-ranging conversation with our participants by having this conversation go in a way you find valuable. So, you know, we three have talked a lot about internal collaboration platforms and ways of building community and communication and all that. We've certainly done a lot of Teams deployments over the last year, and enablement and teaching leaders how to use that effectively. This question is, could executives use their personal social media channels as another way to connect with their teams in a more engaging way? Some employees might feel more comfortable engaging with their leaders on LinkedIn than they would in a virtual town hall or other internal channels, which is really interesting because we know about this, you know, merging between the internal and the external, particularly around oh, hi, doggy, internal and the external. And that's sometimes seen as a fear, you know, oh my God, what we say internal could go external. But what about the opportunity there that is pointed out for that being a good way to connect?
I think not only could they, it is actually expected of them to be active on social channels. There's a new report from Brunswick, which is a global reputation agency, that just did a survey. They talked to 5,200 financial readers and another 6,200 employees at Fortune companies, asking them questions about leaders. So the name of the report is the Connected Leader Study. It's just recently out last couple of weeks, and by a more than 5-to-1 ratio, employees said they prefer to work for a CEO who uses social and digital media. 9 out of 10 financial readers cited the importance of social media from communications during a crisis. I think 60% of employees considering joining a company are going to research a CEO's social media accounts. And I think it was something like 9 out of 10 financial readers will have more trust in the CEO if he or she has a social media presence. So it's no longer negotiable or, you know, hey, should we? It's like, no, the expectation is there. And so leaders have to be connected. And for many, especially during these crises, we saw that they were using external media channels, LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube. I mean, all of those are fair play and they're expected. And even more so when you have a more remote workforce, right? I mean, if you don't have a bunch of employees who are sitting around desks, you've got to find alternative ways and alternative channels and for ways to reach them. So yeah, absolutely they can, and they have to.
Well, and that's a huge change because, as we know,
Yeah.
you know, C-suite in particular, their social media channels, if they have them at all, were very often
Releases.
managed by the EA, the PR team, the agency, the social media team. And we've done a lot of executive activation recently, and we have seen that. But sometimes executive activation means set up an account and manage it for me, right? And so in addition to that being a new skill set for senior leaders and therefore managers, right, should all roll down.
Mm-hmm.
What is that changing relationship between the communications team, Mark, and leaders? What are some of those new skills that, as opposed to you guys doing it, you need to enable around?
I think that's the right question, because social media is in reality a channel, right? The fact is, leaders have to communicate with their staff in whichever way the staff can and prospective staff can receive it. With the most important thing being, it has to be authentic, right? If it's every time the leader publishes something on LinkedIn or on Twitter or on YouTube or on Facebook, it reads like a press release. That's no different than the company just sending something out, and you might as well not have it. But that's also the same for internal communication. So when leaders have town halls, if they're open and honest and really vulnerable about the issues that they feel concerned about, that's how they can build the empathy that staff want to hear from them. And using social media is not a panacea for everything. Great, the CEO has a LinkedIn account, and they publish the email that they sent out to all employees there. That it's just a channel. The type of communications that they do and the way in which they're true and honest and authentic, that's going to be much more impactful.
Yeah, content is king, and you're absolutely right, Gurmeet. I think measuring what a lot of internal and employee communicators are doing these days with executives is not just measuring, hey, do people hear your message and do they understand it? The questions are rapidly moving to, do you trust this answer? Is it credible to you? So to the issue of, is this an authentic voice? Does it show some level of, hey, truthfulness about the good, the bad, and the ugly? Yeah, that's what employees are looking for, right? And so the relationship between, to answer your question, Jen, communications and executives, it's shifting to make sure that it's not just, hey, we want you to communicate through this channel on this topic. There's also a lot of management around, well, is this the right topic for you to be covering? So there's quite a bit of PR that has to go into this too, for both internal and external audiences. I think there's a tendency for many organizations to overuse senior executives to address issues that, quite frankly, they don't need to address every day or every week. At the same time, there are moments where organizations are going through dramatic change or crises where that voice is really important. So the relationship between communications and the executive group is focused on not just what they're saying, but is the occasion right? So there's judgment calls that have to come into play, and we need to be, as a group of professionals, we have to discern when's the right time to use this executive voice.
And are you seeing an increased value by executives of the communications function? It's so often especially internal communications, so often an under-resourced, undervalued, even if it exists,
it's a cost center.
Tapped into at the right time, right? It's kind of the afterthought.
I like to think that, there's a terrible way to say it, but COVID-19 has made employee communication sexy. Because it is, it's all of a sudden very influential. It was the number one issue, literally overnight, as organizations had to shut their doors and send people away. It's like, how are we going to, communicate to our internal stakeholders? So, yes, in fact, this Gallagher report that I was talking about earlier clearly showed that that employee communicators have greater influence, greater seats, and greater voices at the table of influence. And with that, of course, comes more accountability. So it's really employee communications time to shine as they develop strategies, as they measure the impact of what they're doing, and as they report on the analytics of the data points that they're pulling together. So it really is a very big moment for employee communicators to kind of raise their status and influence inside their organizations.
And I think it's the opportunity for them to be the enablers too, right? In my last corporate role, when we were moving to a social intranet environment, and we retrained our internal communications team to say, you're not the mouthpiece of the organization anymore, right? You're not the bullhorn, you're the eyes, you're the ears, you're the enablers of leaders and employees to tell their own stories and to be listening for the conversations that matter to our organization and how we raise those up. And I think, in this era where communications culture, all the things that a formal communications team would be responsible for, but don't have the bandwidth to do, like, what's our role as enablers, as communicators?
Yeah, the days of bring me my communicator, I have something to say to the troops, are pretty much gone, and the role is very much focused on that continuous cycle of feedback loops, right, and then putting those insights into action. And I want to go back to something that both you and Gurmeet were talking about relative to internal communications platforms. Clearly, COVID-19 has accelerated the need and the use for Teams or Yammer or whatever the internal platforms are. The problem is that many of these organizations just expedited their plans for rolling out the technical platforms. And what they didn't do, and what they often don't do well, right, is to educate and engage internal audiences, internal stakeholders on how to really use these tools, right? So it really requires a change management approach, because you're introducing either something completely new to an organization overnight, or you're doubling down on something that's there, but now you really have to engage people on how to use it correctly. And that requires a lot more thought in terms of how you engage people in using those tools. So, I worry that many organizations have just said, okay, well, let's roll out Teams, faster than we were going to, and accelerate it by 6 months. and it's out there, and people are kind of sort of using it, but not really leveraging it, and it's not helping the organization. So if anything, there may be opportunities later this year, early next, for communicators to take a look and say, well, how do we really help the organizations leverage the use of these tools? What kinds of skill sets, what examples, how do we help them see what it can do?
We absolutely saw that, right? So we
Yeah.
saw clients that said, okay, well, one said, we're going to roll it out to the whole senior leadership team and then see how it goes.
Yes.
Like, that's the
Right.
absolute worst group you could roll it out to, because
Yeah.
they're not going to understand
Yeah.
it. They're not going to tell you they don't understand it, right?
It's not going to be a priority.
Right, and then they're just going to go do stuff that they shouldn't be doing, and now we're in a
Yeah.
remote environment. We got all kinds of other issues with cyber.
Right. And if it isn't clear, it doesn't add value, they push it aside and say, I don't know why they're doing that. Let's focus on this. And it just
We
moves
took a
you.
step back, and really, I think the other thing that Microsoft unfortunately has a great product, but they don't customize the training enablement or the specific way that you roll it out to different groups. And so that having the communications team involved in that change, that's a change management. It's a change in the way you work together, right? It's a significant change in the way that you work together, the way that you communicate, the way that you collaborate, the way that you discover information, the way that you share and store information. It's a communications issue in many ways, an enablement issue, but it's not often treated that way. It's the typical thing about, we lead digital transformation with the technology, not the organization, right? So
it's going to be interesting to see. We're talking about this one point in time, but going forward, how much more important is communications as a skill set going to be as we look to who are we going to promote and who are we going to give more responsibility? You can't always rely on the communications team to run the process and give everybody the steps and the tools to make this happen. As we move forward, it's going to be, in addition to the hard skills that people need to have and the soft skills that people have typically had about leadership and making smart decisions and stuff like that, the ability to communicate in all these new different ways is going to be even more important to deciding who's going to be in charge of leadership within organizations.
So Mark, you had said managers need new skill sets. That's clearly one, right? What are some other skill sets that managers need that maybe we haven't paid enough attention to in the traditional world of work?
Well, I mean, I think there's ongoing always development needs for performance management, right? About setting those clear expectations that I mentioned before, about setting up cadence and sequences of regular check-ins with employees, about setting very clear goals, managing poor performance. So I think those are things that they're always out there, but they become much bigger potential issues or problems when managers don't have direct and regular access to their employees as they used to. But clearly communication is one of them. Even the interpersonal types of communications, the reading of the body language. Hey, all of a sudden, is somebody not on video and they've just got their image there? Are they dialing in? Those are all signals that someone, and if it's regular and it's different than the behaviors of team members prior to that, those can be really important signals for managers to pick up on. And if you're not really in tune with it, you're just like, okay, I just saw Jen's picture on the Zoom call today. I didn't even think about the fact that for the last 4 calls, that's all I've seen of her. But I know she's there. And so those kinds of interpersonal body language types of feedback are really important for managers to tune into.
And Jen, to add on that, I'd say one thing that has always been important, but I think the importance is going to just continue to increase, is empathy and understanding where it is that employees might be coming from, because the demands that employees are going to make on their employers are going to continue to change. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, everybody was talking about how are we going to keep millennials. Millennials are so different than the previous generations and stuff like that. That's still true, and Adrian maybe can tell us about that. But
she's not even a millennial.
I know, so she can tell about her older siblings. But with the new ways of working, and again, employees understanding that companies can do things that they previously said they couldn't, if there's a company that isn't going to understand what employees' needs are, whether it's they're single parent and understanding that being able to avoid the 1 hour commute each way is a huge impact on them and their ability to spend more time with their kids, and or somebody has a health issue that in the past meant they just couldn't have a job because those types of jobs, the types of jobs that they were potentially suited for meant they had to work in an office, and for whatever reason they couldn't do that. Going forward, these types of people have a ton of skill sets that an empathetic employer will understand. Leveraging those people and providing them with the accommodations that we've always been able to provide is going to be able to help them retain and attract and promote the best people for the job. And this also leads into some of the other issues that we were talking about what does the future of organizations look like from almost a more practical logistical standpoint, right? If you're hiring for a role and you're a bank that's headquartered in New York, why does everybody have to be in New York for the next new role when people are able to work remotely, right? So now instead of offshoring your call center, can you just make it a distributed call center, and anybody in the world can do these functions from home? So you can go to rural America or rural Canada. You're no longer offshoring to get it a center of excellence. And then that again brings in all those issues that we were just talking about.
Yeah,
so
follow the sun or 24/7.
Exactly.
Here and more efficient and cheaper, right? If you have people all over the place. We have another question about, and it references something I think, Gurmeet, you said before, is that we almost have an embarrassment of riches of the ways to communicate with our employees, right? Internal, external collaboration platforms, but employees have different ways. Staff has different ways that they prefer to get their communication. Messaging might be a little bit different for different groups, or a little bit different from platform to platform. None of us would advocate sticking the same thing on every platform, right? So what are your suggestions about how to deal with that and make sure that the right message gets the right staff member at the right time, in the right way, and not have it be so overwhelming, but very effective?
I think if anybody says that they have the answer to that, they're probably trying to sell you a bridge. I don't think there is a specific answer, but there's sort of concepts, which is, understanding certain messages are best done in person. Certain messages are best, are perhaps, virtual. Some can be in email. So, if it's a news item that needs to go out, and then those things, you have to do that via press release, via email, or whatever the case is. One-on-one communication isn't always possible. When you've got a CEO of 100,000 person company, she or he can't necessarily have a conversation with every single person. But that's where you have the pyramid. That's where you have cascading. And it's going to be hit or miss, and it's going to depend on your employees. It's going to depend on your culture. And I'd say it's basically understanding all the different tools at your disposal, and just trying to continue to refine your messaging and the tools that you use to do it. I'd say Mark probably has an even more refined answer to that.
Well, you did a great job, Gurmeet. Yeah, the one thing that I might add is, like anything in marketing or communications, the more you know about your internal stakeholders, the better you're able to customize the messages to them. So, everything starts with what's the message, right? And we know, those of us who've been doing this for a while, is that you have a core message, but you always address it for the needs of unique internal stakeholders. So between understanding your stakeholders and what we call segmenting them, Jen knows I'm actually writing a book, and I have a whole chapter on this, how you segment your internal stakeholders. And then there's the whole issue of sequencing, right? I mean, so to Gurmeet's point, the CEO can't sit down and talk with everybody, but there is a certain rationale and an order many times that would dictate a different type of sequencing to who gets what messages and when, and what those messages look like. So, for example, when you're, managing change, and let's say HR is driving a new benefit or comp plan or whatever it's going to be, that your communication plan will start and probably start with the HR business professionals who are going to have to, represent this change to managers and to other employees. then you're going to have to think about the people who may be at a service center who are going to take those employee calls, and they have to be prepared with far more details, quite frankly, than the average employee. And then executives are going to need to be equipped with certain kinds of messaging that may be a little bit more high level, but on certain issues go a little deeper, et cetera, right? So just examples of the fact that it's never a one size fits all. And I think that's where, especially the more complicated the change, the more risky the change, and the more, we'll just say bad news, the change, the more it really requires some finesse in deciding who gets what information and how detailed and when, right? So these things all work together to, create, we'll call it an internal communications ecosystem that delivers the right information at the right time to the right person.
I think that's 100% right. And something that Mark said earlier about content is king. Your message has to be consistent to the extent that it can be, because employees are not dumb. I used to work in an organization where there would be an earnings call and the CEO would talk about how great the company's doing and we're hitting our targets. And the next day there would be an internal announcement about another round of layoffs, right? And they lost all credibility, especially with the next quarter, they'd miss their targets again. And so making sure you're really being honest with people. I think the days of papering over issues and just soft pedaling anytime that there's a problem, they should be behind us. I think the faster we get ahead of issues, the more honest we are about potential downsides. You don't have to give every single detail about the number of people who are going to be laid off if we don't get this big sale, but being very true to what exactly is happening has to be a big part of the message.
Yeah, also the whole idea of influence, right? Do you get access to those external announcements that are going to be all about how great the quarter was, knowing that on the internal side, hey, tomorrow we have this, layoff coming. Do we have a seat at the table when those discussions are happening about the external communications that will precede this, so that we can help influence this? And I will tell you, many times in my career, I've been at that table going, hold on, we got to adjust this, because if you go down this road of how wonderfully we're performing, and tomorrow you're going to lay off 5,000, 10,000 people, you're going to have a much bigger issue to deal with that you need to. So don't ask for this trouble. Let's make sure we have that influence and that conversation before these types of communications go out. So I think, go back to your comment earlier, Jen, about the influence of employee communications, that some good things are really happening there where there's a seat at the table. One of the trends that has, I think, a little bit of risk associated with it is that we're seeing more internal communications functions reporting through functions that are not either communication or external PR oriented, namely reporting through HR, which can be a good thing in many organizations. But sometimes when you have sort of these parallel tracks of internal reports up through, let's say, HR and PR reports up through, whatever it is, legal's chief marketing officer, et cetera, you don't get that connection early enough to be able to influence, the integrated messaging. So it's one of the things that we're seeing more of internal communications starting to report into HR. And there are some really great rationales and reasons for that, right? So we haven't talked about the employee experience and how that COVID has really set that ablaze, right? So people have always been talking about the employee experience. Well, now it is a real thing. And if you're not matching up the employee experience with your employee value proposition, you're in for a world of hurt, and you're not going to be able to recruit, and you're not going to be able to retain, because back to the issue of transparency, people will talk. So there's so much going on here, and I don't mean to ramble, but I think the issue of internal comms being able to influence the message, it has to be done in a way both structurally and operationally where it's connected to the external world, and that obviously affects the employee experience well.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, in my last corporate role, I was fortunate that it did roll up HR, and HR was CCO was, we were all part of kind of the same organization, and then things got reorged as they do in big companies. But the most efficient, the best situation was when I was able to oversee all digital internally and externally.
Yep.
Right. And so a member of my team was responsible for coordinating the earnings announcement over external channels. A member of my team was responsible of making sure
Yeah.
that that tweet was going to go out the minute that it hit the wires, and another member was responsible for making sure that the employee email, and then it was going to go out on our hub, which was our internal. And
Yeah.
having those opportunities not only logistically to make sure things were joined up, but to your point, Mark, about being sensitive to having that purview over what are the internal things we need to be saying, what are the external things we need to be saying, and how do all of the things that we're saying roll up to who we are as an organization, our mission, purpose, and values, the core objectives that we have for the year and more generally. And when you have a company of any size, really, there's always going to be kind of competing things that need to be said and need to be focused on. And so the more joining up of those functions, I think, the better.
Yeah, if they're not structurally connected, they have to functionally and operationally be connected, right? So you have to constitute those connection points if it doesn't happen through a structure, and that takes a lot of very proactive work, I think, on sides of everybody who touches communications.
I'd say I don't think I've been part of an organization that hasn't said they have a problem with silos, right? And so you can have major programs where things work a lot better and they're a lot more organic, where you've got communications and investor relations and finance and HR and the business all sitting down talking about the major change that you're going to undergo. And you're going to have people with their individual expertise sitting there and saying, well, this is the impact that it's going to have on employees. And the communications folks saying, this is how we need to get that messaging out. And the business saying, well, this is the reason why I need to do it. And that unfortunately doesn't always translate to the entire business as a whole. Again, the larger the organization is, the tougher it is to make sure that organic cohesion and working across the functional areas, it exists. We've spent a lot of time talking about the communications, almost the big C communications and small C communications within an organization, whether it's communicating major changes or communicating within employees, and how do you make sure that everybody's working together. And then just in this last conversation, Jen, I think you brought up, the role of HR and how complex that's going to be. And, one of the things that I find more interesting, we've gone from some of the big picture issues to some of the more real details, nitty gritty that we're going to have to talk about in terms of, I think it was Facebook that said, if somebody wants to take a job that typically would have been in San Francisco, we're going to allow, or the Bay Area, we're going to allow you to work from anywhere in anywhere, but there might be a discount because of cost of living. And if that is something that people are going to apply, and then if you move to New York City, where maybe it's more expensive than the Bay Area, are you going to pay people more than if they were living in the Bay Area? One of the things Mark and I were speaking about in advance of this call was, typically as you move up an organization, you get a little bit more flexibility, right? You get a little bit more vacation time. You can set perhaps a little bit more of your hours, whereas when you're a junior person, going forward, does becoming more senior mean you have more or less chance to work from home? Because sometimes you want the leaders to set the example, and an invisible leader is not really a leader, but does that mean you have to be in the office, especially when 20%, 50%, 80% of your staff aren't in the office anyways? Or does it mean that it's more important that you have that one central thread there? And so these types of decisions, obviously the business leaders have to be involved with, but this is hopefully where HR can bring really their expertise and their understanding of how things will best work in sort of this new paradigm. It's going to be super interesting to see how that works in different organizations, because they're all going to take, every organization is going to be a little bit different, and seeing how these different logistical issues play out and which ones work, which ones don't, will be, I'm sure, the focus of numerous academic studies over the next 10, 20 years.
I am so glad you brought up the issue of paying less to live in certain locales. I mean, what do you guys think about that from a cultural standpoint? There's already such a great sensitivity to pay scales and disparity amongst pay scales. You think about the people that would make that choice to maybe not be in a major city center. Does that inherently create disparity amongst pay scales? And so what are your thoughts on the good idea that may or may not be?
It's, it's really, I live in what apparently just was named the fifth most expensive housing city in the world. So, I'm all for, paying for cost of living. But in reality, just the way these things are going to work, I've worked with a lot of organizations that have offshored because they wanted to get lower cost employees. But now when what if somebody is hired in North America at a North American rate and says, guess what? I'm going to go move back to the Philippines where my family is or where the cost of living is lower. I'm going to still work North America hours. Well, are you going to make their pay equivalent to what an employee in the Philippines would have had? Just the logistical issues of making that work, whether it's even within the same borders. If you move from New York City to Wyoming, I'm assuming the cost of living is going to go down. How do you address that? Do you say, an employee is an employee is an employee? Basically what you're going to do is you're then going to encourage people to move away from some of the major population centers. Not everybody. Some people want, to be in a big urban center for whatever reasons, but others are going to say the cost isn't worth it. And we're seeing that I live in Toronto. We're seeing a lot of people moving further away from the downtown core because when you're doing a commute 5 days a week, twice a day, an hour and a half, 2-hour commute is impossible. If you're coming in once a week, that makes a lot more sense, especially if you're going to save 50% on your housing costs.
Well, and there's the added issue of tax codes, right? So companies it's going to get really complicated very quickly. And defining, we touched on this very earlier, but a little bit earlier, but what is a community, right? What is a community and how does that impact cost of living? And even more broadly, as companies are thinking about, their ESG or their CSR programs, including employee volunteerism and philanthropy, things that used to be slam dunks. Hey, we're located in this city. Our community is this city. It's like, that's done, right? So companies are now having to rethink, well, is community where my people are, or is community where my brick and mortar is? Whereas community is something, both that span both of those descriptors. So they've got some work to do, right? But it definitely plays into this issue of like what you make and where you're located. Yeah. But I started this off with the tax codes because as somebody who's I've lived in Connecticut, I worked in New York. At one point I was working in Delaware. I mean, just the things about where you are, how much time you spend in a certain location dictates the tax issues that you have to deal with and your company has to deal with.
Oh yeah.
This is not a simple.
Taxes pulled out in New York and California for a time. It affects sports sponsorships, Gurmeet, something near and dear to both our hearts. Where do you put your logo on which team if you don't have a center? But this really does. If you're encouraging your employees for cost savings purposes or whatever to whatever purpose to move out of this core where you've had your center of operations, what does that do to the community within your company as well as the community itself, and how does that change the relationship? As we said, from boomtown to zoomtown, like what is that, and then how do these smaller entities that corporations may have little footprints in, how do they benefit from the company, or do they?
Yeah, and this is one of those changes that isn't going to be an overnight, right? If a major bank has an operation center of 20,000 people in one location, now that people have the opportunity to work from home, all 20,000 of them are not going to leave that location. They're not all going to move away. Some people are going to want to stay there, but it's going to be an evolution. And when new people are hired, for both the company's benefit and the employee's benefit, it'll make sense for that to be a little bit more distributed. Not everybody wants to live in that big city, and not every great employee is available in that big city. So you're going to want to make sure that you have the opportunity to hire some of the great people who perhaps don't want to live in Toronto or New York or the Bay Area. And you'll have to find a way to go to them to recruit. Who are they? Where are they? And then again, the question of pay. Are you going to pay somebody who lives in Wyoming less than you pay somebody who lives in New York City if they're doing the exact same job?
Yep. And I think the companies that figure this out and they do it right are going to be talking a lot more with their employees about what they want. Research is showing that there's a 25% increase in the use of pulse surveys this year versus last year. So it shows that companies are asking, they want to listen to what their employees do, more of them at least want to do that. But the flip side of this, and I touched on this earlier, there's also responsibilities for employees here too, right? So unlike past years where you might say, oh, it's another stupid org health survey or pulse survey, they never listened to me. You know what? You're 100% right of them not acting on your insights if you don't fulfill these things out. So there are responsibilities that employees have in this sort of new deal that we've been talking about, and that includes giving feedback when asked for it. Also being more proactive and asking managers, how am I doing? What are you seeing? How do I engage? How do I improve the work that I'm doing? Being more proactive with peers and trying to reach out. So, look, this is tough. It's tough for employers. It's tough for employees. But both sides of that equation have, I think, a role to play in being more proactive about addressing the unique needs of this new deal, right? So answer the questions when they're asked of you, and even when they're not. If you want to give any kind of feedback, it's good for you, and it's good for the organization to hear from you.
See, there's Mark always bringing it back to communications.
I'm good with that.
Yeah.
All right, we've only got a couple minutes left. We wanted Adria to be able to tell us about our upcoming next webinar in this series. But okay, so last key takeaway. We've probably got on, I'm looking on our list of attendees today. I don't know who everybody is, obviously, but I think we've got a lot of leaders. We've got some CEOs. We've got senior leaders. So let's direct the last bit of advice to them. Key takeaway, like what we've identified lots of challenges, lots of issues, things we're going to discover. We've definitely talked about communications. We've talked about co-creation of the new world with employees. But if you want to tell one thing that you would recommend that leaders go away and do today to get ready for this new world, what would it be?
I'm going to steal Mark's last point and say that communications has historically been top down one way. I'd say over the last 10, maybe 15 years, we've seen organizations do a lot more employee surveys, listening to their staff. I'd say the importance of that is going to go up exponentially, especially as people are moving away. It's not just about how do you communicate to the employees, it's how do you listen to them and how do you hear from them and take that feedback and make some of these major decisions that we're talking about and do it for the best of your organization and the future of your organization, because your employees today aren't necessarily your employees of 10 years from now. And the best leaders are the ones who are thinking not just today or 5 years from now, it's 10, 20, 30 years down the road.
I'm going to go with be intentional about values, about behavior, about your mission and vision. Do not let your culture move to default simply because you're not making this something that as it should be on the front burner. So figure out with your communication leaders, internal comms, how you make sure this stays on the front burner. It's on every agenda. There's a proactive strategy that is developed and executed about ensuring that the culture you want is the one that you're communicating to and the one that you're modeling behaviors to, not the one you're just letting evolve.
Awesome. Mark, Gurmeet, thank you so much. This has been a fantastic discussion. I appreciate you doing it. Adria, you want to close us out here?
Yes, I do. So a recording of this session will be available on biznology.com. We also have another webinar coming up on April 8th. It is Where is B2B Marketing Headed in 2021? So this is also a part of our 2021 Trend Series. I will send out more information with that with the recap, so look out for that. But thank you everyone for joining, and we hope to see you at our next webinar. Thank you, Mark and Gurmeet.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everyone.
Okay.